A racist, power-drunk cop humiliated a young black girl and tied her to train tracks to instill fear and assert his control, thinking it would be just another scare tactic he'd get away with. But what he didn't know, was that her father, the chief of police, would arrive within seconds and witness everything. And what he did to that officer, shocked everyone. It all started on an ordinary weekday afternoon. The kind of day when the air feels still and harmless, and no one expects their life to change in a matter of minutes. She had just left school, her backpack bouncing lightly on her shoulder as she pedaled through the quiet suburban street, her headphones drowning out the world. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Not even close. She was simply being a teenager. Black. On a bike. With music in her ears. In the wrong part of town. The kind of neighborhood where certain people still believe they own the pavement. The kind of place where skin color is a provocation on its own. He spotted her near the corner store, riding slowly, looking at her phone for directions, trying to find the shortcut home her friend had told her about. But to him, she didn't belong. To him, that image, a young black girl on a bike in a predominantly white neighborhood, wasn't just out of place, it was a threat. Or at least, he decided to treat it like one. And that was all it took. The cop made a sharp U-turn, tires screeching like he was chasing a criminal, not a schoolgirl. She saw the lights flash in her peripheral vision, felt her stomach drop. She stopped. Confused. Innocent. Before she could ask why, he was already out of the car, barking orders she didn't understand. Off the bike. Hands where I can see them. Her voice cracked when she asked what was going on. But her confusion only made him angrier. He grabbed her arm. Yanked her off the bike so hard she scraped her knees. She stumbled. Cried out. Still confused. Still trying to comply. Still wondering what she had done wrong. He shoved her toward the sidewalk, her backpack falling off and her phone skidding across the ground. She tried to speak again, voice trembling, "I didn't do anything," and he snapped. "Oh, you didn't do anything?" he mocked, loud and brutal, grabbing zip ties from his belt. "You think you're smart, huh? Just riding around like you're untouchable." "I go to school down the street," she started, but he cut her off. "I don't give a damn where you go. You're in my neighborhood now. You don't make the rules here." The zip ties burned against her wrists as he tightened them with unnecessary force. She was shaking. Knees scraped and bleeding. Breathing hard. Trying not to panic. But it was happening too fast. He dragged her, not gently, not cautiously, across the gravel lot beside the tracks, toward the metal rails that cut across the back end of the town. The place was empty, silent, the hum of the wind the only sound besides her whimpering. She didn't scream yet. She didn't know what he was doing. Not until he forced her down beside the track, tied her ankles too, and stood back. "That's better," he said, smirking. "Now you're gonna learn what fear really feels like." Her eyes went wide. "What are you doing?" she gasped, suddenly trying to sit up, her voice shrill now, panic cutting through. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before wandering around acting like you own the place. Maybe next time, you'll shut your damn mouth." "I didn't do anything wrong," she sobbed. "Please." "Oh, there's a train that comes through here every 20 minutes, he said, checking his watch with theatrical calm. "You've got, what, maybe 6 minutes. Let's see if your little attitude survives that long." She was screaming now, twisting, crying out for help that wasn't coming. Her voice cracked. She begged. She said she was sorry even though she didn't know what for. She promised to never come back here again. She swore she was just trying to get home. But he just stood there. Watching. Enjoying it. Then. A sound. Not from the tracks. From behind. Gravel shifting. Tires kicking up dust. An SUV slamming to a stop. She turned her head as best she could. Her tears blurred her vision, but she saw the door fly open. She recognized that silhouette. She knew that voice. Step away from her. Now. The officer turned, startled. Don't say another word. Take your hands off your belt, step back, and kneel. What? Kneel. The rage in that voice could have shattered glass. And in that moment, the dynamic flipped completely. The predator became the prey. The abuser was exposed. The truth was undeniable, the girl he tried to silence had power on her side. And that power didn't come from violence. It came from truth. It came from the badge of a man who actually earned it. Who didn't need to break a teenager to feel big. Who stood not just as a father, but as justice itself. What happened next wasn't just a personal reckoning. It wasn't just about a father defending his daughter. It became a war inside the system. A chain reaction. A scandal that would rock the department, the city, and beyond. Because when the body cam footage surfaced, when the public saw the raw footage of a terrified, zip-tied black girl lying on train tracks for nothing, it wasn't just a news story. It was a call to action. The system had protected men like him for far too long. But not this time. This time, someone stood up. This time, someone fought back. And the man who once held all the power, would soon be begging for mercy. But the question still remains, what exactly did her father do, in those next few seconds, that shocked even the toughest officers in the force? What really happened between the chief and the man who dared to terrorize his daughter? And how did a teenage girl go from being humiliated on the ground to becoming the voice of an entire movement? You're about to find out. Stay with us. To every black viewer watching this video right now, you are seen, you are heard, and you matter. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and abuse of power. This platform is a space for justice, truth, and stories that echo real voices and real struggles. Today's story may be tough, but it's about resilience, truth, and justice catching up. Enjoy the story, and if this message resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and help us keep sharing stories that matter. It was the kind of town where everything looked calm on the surface, but tension lived just beneath the quiet. Oak Ridge, North Carolina, a small city tucked between whispering forests and endless stretches of suburban homes, where the houses were neatly spaced and the lawns were always manicured. It was the kind of place where people left their porch lights on at night more out of routine than necessity. But it was also the kind of place where a black child could be treated like a stranger just for crossing into the wrong zip code. And 17-year-old Amara Williams knew that reality far too well, even if she tried every day not to let it define her. Amara was the kind of girl who made teachers smile and classmates feel understood. She didn't try to stand out, but she couldn't help it. Her laugh was rich and contagious, her curiosity boundless, her mind razor-sharp. She loved science, could spend hours getting lost in documentaries, and dreamed of becoming a biomedical engineer. But she also knew how to read people, how to lower her voice and shrink her presence in certain spaces, because that's what the world had taught her to do. She had the kind of beauty that glowed without permission, deep brown skin kissed by the sun, eyes that held stories older than her years, and a quiet strength that her father used to say came from her grandmother. Her father, Chief Raymond Williams, was the most respected man in Oak Ridge, and for good reason. He wasn't just the chief of police. He was a leader who had earned every ounce of that title. A black man who had risen through the ranks with discipline, dignity, and unshakable moral code. For the past 25 years, he had walked into precincts that weren't built for men who looked like him, and still, he commanded every room he entered. He believed in law, in justice, but above all, he believed in doing what was right, even when it wasn't popular. His badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a shield he tried to use to protect the community, and more than anything, his daughter. Raymond had raised Amara alone since she was 9, after her mother passed away from breast cancer. It was just the two of them in a modest but warm home on the east side of town, where the neighbors looked out for each other and the air always smelled like collard greens on Sundays. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in grief, strengthened by love, and carried on mutual respect. He called her his miracle, and she called him her anchor. Every night, no matter how long his shift had been, he would sit at the edge of her bed and ask about her day. And every morning, he made sure she had a packed lunch, even if he had to be at the station by dawn. Despite everything, Amara never used her father's title to her advantage. In fact, she rarely told people who he was. She didn't want special treatment. She wanted to be seen for who she was, not for who her father was. So she kept her head down, focused on school, and stayed out of trouble. She knew how quickly the world could turn against her for a single misstep. She'd seen it happen to friends, to cousins, to classmates. And no matter how careful she was, there were always places where her skin made her a target. That's what led her to that street on that day, not rebellion, not defiance, just a simple desire to get home quicker. Her best friend had told her about a shortcut that shaved 10 minutes off the ride, one that cut through the back of a wealthier neighborhood. She'd hesitated at first, knowing full well how people might look at her there. But it was broad daylight. She had her school ID in her pocket. She was wearing her hoodie with the high school emblem stitched on the sleeve. And most of all, she was tired. She had a biology test the next day, and all she wanted was to get home, eat dinner, and study. The road she took was lined with tall pine trees and expensive cars parked in driveways that looked like magazine covers. She kept her eyes forward, her music low, and pedaled slowly. Her backpack was heavy, filled with books and notes. She was halfway through the neighborhood when she noticed the cruiser parked up ahead, engine idling, the officer inside watching her through dark sunglasses. She felt her stomach tighten, instinctively slowing her pace. The cruiser didn't move. Neither did the officer. She passed, cautiously, trying to act natural, but she could feel his eyes tracking her like a spotlight. She didn't look back. Not until she heard the engine roar. The tires screeched as the car pulled out of its spot and rolled up beside her. She heard the window drop, then the sharp tone of his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Hey! You! Stop the bike!" Amara pressed her brakes, her heart thudding in her chest. She turned slowly. "Is something wrong, officer? You live around here?" I go to school down the street. I'm just passing through, didn't ask where you go to school. I asked if you live here. I live on the east side." He stepped out of the car. Tall. Heavy-set. White. The kind of face that looked like it had never smiled for the right reasons. His name was Officer Brent Holloway, and he'd been on the force for 6 years. To some, he was just a hothead. To others, a necessary enforcer. But to many in the black community, he was a nightmare, someone who saw badges as permission slips to dominate, belittle, and intimidate. He'd never been formally disciplined, but everyone had a story. Everyone knew who he was. He looked at Amara like she was a threat. Not a girl. Not a student. Just a body on a bike in the wrong place. He didn't care about who her father was. He didn't care that she'd done nothing wrong. All he saw was a black girl on a white street, and that was enough. "You got ID?" Amara fumbled for her wallet, hands shaking. "Yes, it's in my backpack, don't move," he barked, suddenly tense, like he was expecting her to run. "Keep your hands where I can see them." She froze. I wasn't, step off the bike. Now. She obeyed, slowly. Her knees wobbled. Her chest felt like it might cave in. She was trying to stay calm, but every second felt heavier than the last. She could feel people watching from their windows, blinds twitching, phones maybe recording. But no one was coming outside. No one was stopping it. He yanked the backpack off her shoulder, dropped it to the ground, and pushed her against the car. She winced. You know what you look like to me, he muttered, low and bitter. A little punk who thinks the rules don't apply. I was just going home, you were trespassing. I didn't know, I bet you think you're real smart, huh? Riding through here like you belong. I didn't do anything, she whispered. Exactly. That's your problem. He reached for the zip ties. And from that moment forward, nothing in Amara's life would ever be the same. She would never forget the gravel scraping her skin. The cold bite of plastic cutting into her wrists. The sound of the train horn echoing in the distance as he dragged her down the slope. The feeling of powerlessness as she begged for her voice to matter. And somewhere, not far away, her father was finishing up paperwork at the precinct, thinking his daughter would be home by now. Thinking she was safe. But the next few minutes would test every principle he had ever stood for. Because nothing prepared him for what he was about to witness. And nothing would stop what came after. The pressure against Amara's chest felt unbearable as her back hit the cold gravel and the zip ties cinched tighter. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear the sound of her own breathing. Each breath was shallow, clipped by panic, and her legs twitched involuntarily as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. Officer Holloway's hands moved quickly, efficiently, as if this were a routine procedure. His face remained cold, unreadable, his mouth curling with a sick satisfaction as he secured her ankles. The silence of the area was only broken by the occasional gust of wind and the quiet creaking of the nearby railroad crossing sign swaying in the distance. There was no one else around. No witness strong enough to stop him. And he liked it that way. He leaned down close to her face and hissed something she would never forget. You want to play smart in my neighborhood? Let's see how clever you are when you hear steel scream toward your head, and then he stood up and walked back toward his patrol car, pulling his phone from his pocket casually, like this was all part of some twisted lesson plan. She screamed after him, her voice raw, cracking as she begged him not to leave her there, to untie her, to give her a chance to explain, but he just raised a finger to his ear and pretended to check for train sounds. Amara's mind raced. Her thoughts weren't just about the train anymore. They were filled with shame, fear, disbelief, and confusion. Was this really happening? Was this really her life now? Her skin felt hot with humiliation, the sharp rocks digging into her back, her arms stretched awkwardly behind her, her legs bound like she was some kind of criminal. Her mouth was dry, and her voice was nearly gone. She didn't know what time it was, but she remembered he said something about 20 minutes. She didn't know if it had been 5 or 15. She looked at the horizon, at the empty tracks, trying to calculate whether she could roll herself out in time if she heard something. But she couldn't even sit up. Back at the precinct, Chief Raymond Williams had just stepped into his office after a long meeting about community outreach programs. His phone buzzed once, then again. The second time, it was a text from Amara's best friend. Did Amara get home yet? He frowned. He glanced at the clock. She should have been home over 30 minutes ago. His instincts kicked in fast. He knew his daughter. She was always punctual. She always texted if she was running late. He called her phone, no answer. Tried again. Straight to voicemail. A cold tightness settled in his gut. He grabbed his keys and headed out without a word. Officer Brent Holloway stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, pacing slowly, watching the girl with the kind of distance that made it clear, he didn't see her as human. He was making a point. To her. To himself. To the town. And no one was supposed to stop him. He glanced around, casually leaned against his car, and shook his head with mock disappointment. You all bark, he muttered. No respect. That's the damn problem. Amara's voice cracked as she forced herself to speak again, this time weaker, more desperate. Please. I have asthma. I can't breathe lying like this. He smirked. Should have thought about that before you decided to play activist in my neighborhood. She closed her eyes, the tears rolling down her cheeks mixing with the dust and dirt. She tried to picture her father's face, the way he used to rub her back when she was sick, the calm in his voice when she had nightmares. She wondered if he would know what happened, if he'd find her in time, if he'd even believe her. She wasn't even sure she believed it herself. The moment Raymond turned onto Brookshire Avenue, something felt off. There was a patrol car parked ahead on the side of the road, just past the bike path. The silhouette near the tracks drew his attention immediately. A man in uniform pacing, and someone else, lying down. His foot slammed the brake, gravel flying as the SUV skidded slightly. He jumped out before the engine fully stopped, eyes locked on the scene ahead. "Amara," he called once, uncertain. The officer turned, startled. Amara's head snapped up. Raymond's blood froze in his veins. There was no sound. No train. No movement. Just the deafening silence that hits right before a storm shatters everything. "Sir, this isn't what it looks like," Holloway said quickly, lifting both hands slightly. "I had to restrain her, she was acting suspicious." Raymond didn't move. He didn't blink. His eyes scanned the zip ties, the bruises forming on her arms, the fear in her eyes. His jaw tightened, and something shifted behind his expression, something dark and focused. Amara sobbed his name, unable to lift her head. "Daddy," Raymond walked forward slowly, methodically, his badge gleaming in the dimming light. He stopped just inches from Holloway, his voice dangerously calm. "You're going to untie her." "Chief, now." The tension between them was suffocating. Holloway hesitated, his face losing color. He reached for the ties, his hands trembling slightly now. He cut them loose with the knife from his belt, and Amara let out a cry of pain as she tried to sit up, her wrists burning. Raymond dropped to his knees beside her, holding her face in his hands, inspecting every inch of her for injury, whispering reassurances even as his own hands shook. "I've got you, baby. I've got you." Holloway stood stiffly behind them, watching, unsure whether to run or speak. Raymond stood slowly. The calm in his voice cracked as he turned to face the man who had just tried to break his daughter. "Do you have any idea who she is?" "I didn't recognize her." "No," Raymond interrupted, his voice a low, fierce growl. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" There was no answer. Only the wind. Raymond called for backup, not calmly, not professionally, but with the fire of a father who had just found his child zip-tied to train tracks. His voice boomed through the radio, and within minutes, the quiet street was filled with sirens. Squad cars pulled in from every direction. Officers stepped out, their faces shifting from confusion to horror as they took in the scene. Amara sat wrapped in a blanket now, in the back of a car with a medic checking her vitals. Her eyes were blank, staring at nothing. The trauma hadn't caught up yet. But it would. Soon. Holloway was surrounded. His badge no longer held any power. The whispers had already begun. Cameras were on him now. Phone screens glowing. Officers murmuring. No one was stepping forward to defend him. One of the sergeants approached Raymond hesitantly. "Sir, what do you want us to do?" Raymond looked at his daughter again, then back at the man who had dared to lay a hand on her. "Book him." The handcuffs clicked. The world shifted. But this was only the beginning. The city would soon know what happened. The headlines would follow. The footage from Holloway's body cam had been running the entire time. And when the truth came out, when the raw footage hit the public, it wouldn't just be Holloway who had to answer for it. There were others. People who had turned a blind eye to complaints, who had dismissed stories, who had protected the wrong man for far too long. And the reckoning that was coming would burn straight through every layer of silence. But no one, not even Chief Raymond Williams, was prepared for just how deep the corruption would go, or what he would have to sacrifice to make it right. Now, the real story was just beginning. The sound of the fluorescent lights buzzing in the Internal Affairs conference room was almost deafening in the silence that had taken over. Chief Raymond Williams sat at the head of the table, his posture unreadable, the fingers of one hand curled around a cold paper cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. Across from him, representatives from the city council, the district attorney's office, and 2 department captains all sat in tight silence, the footage paused on the large screen mounted to the wall behind them. The image frozen was damning, Holloway standing by his cruiser, arms crossed, looking smug while Amara lay on the gravel, bound and terrified. No one had spoken since the video ended. There was no need to. The truth had been exposed with such clarity that even those who tried to justify him in the past could no longer breathe through their shame. The video had gone public just hours earlier. Within 30 minutes, the city's phone lines were overwhelmed. Protesters were already organizing outside the department building. Hashtags were trending. Local stations cut into their regular programming. Holloway's face was everywhere. And with it, came the heat of decades of ignored complaints, mishandled cases, quiet transfers, and bureaucratic silence. For years, he had been moved from one beat to another, quietly reassigned, protected by higher-ups who feared the blowback of public discipline. But now, the protection had evaporated. Raymond broke the silence. His voice was slow, weighted, not angry, but something far worse, disappointed beyond repair. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. Every person in this room signed off on that man's performance reviews. Every one of you dismissed complaints. You let this happen. The room shifted with discomfort. One of the captains cleared his throat but said nothing. The DA's representative, a woman with lines etched deeply into her face from years of hard politics, spoke next. Chief Williams, no one here is denying what the footage shows. It's indefensible. But we're here to discuss the department's legal liability, not. Raymond's stare cut through her before she could finish. She's 17. She was on her way home from school. And a man wearing our badge tied her to train tracks. She swallowed hard, suddenly finding no ground to stand on. Outside, the volume of the crowd was growing. Amara sat in the back seat of a city vehicle parked in the garage, shielded from cameras and questions, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her body ached, but she hadn't spoken much since the incident. She kept her eyes low, watching the floor, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened, or what was still unfolding. Back in the conference room, a younger internal affairs investigator spoke, his voice steady but cautious. "Sir, there's more. We found previous dash cam footage that was never logged properly. He's done this before. 3 other minors. 1 girl. 2 boys. No physical restraints, but aggressive intimidation, verbal abuse, and threats. Same pattern. All black. All in white majority neighborhoods." The air shifted. Raymond exhaled slowly. And none of it ever made it to review boards. They were buried. One file was marked as incomplete due to technical malfunction. The other 2 were flagged as inconclusive. We also found a pattern of GPS pings from Holloway's cruiser showing long stationary stops outside local high schools, parks, even a community center. He was watching them. Looking for them. The DA leaned forward, finally shaken. Why wasn't this escalated? Who signed off on the reports? Silence. Raymond stood now, slowly, as if his bones had turned to lead. "I am the chief of police in a city where my daughter could have died at the hands of one of our own. Where a man I once sat beside in roll call meetings used our badge to terrorize children. And the system didn't just fail to stop him. It protected him." His voice broke slightly at the edges. "She trusted that badge. Because of me." No one looked him in the eye. In the hallway outside the room, 2 officers escorted Holloway down the corridor toward Holding. His hands were cuffed, his shirt still stained from the scuffle during the arrest. He walked slowly, head lowered, but his mouth was moving, whispering bitter things to himself, jaw tight with defiance. He was still clinging to the illusion that it could all be spun, that maybe someone would bail him out, that maybe he'd walk free. After all, he always had before. When Raymond stepped out of the room, the two men locked eyes. "You feel big now?" Holloway muttered, a cruel grin curling at the edge of his mouth. "You think this changes anything?" Raymond's feet stopped inches from him. His voice was low. Controlled. "I warned you. You don't get to wear that badge and play God. I did what needed to be done." She was disrespectful. Uncooperative. She was a child. She was my daughter. And you were a coward. I did what I was trained to do. No. You did what you thought you could get away with. I'm not the only one. That sentence hung in the air like poison. Raymond didn't flinch. And you think dragging others down with you is going to save you? I think exposing the whole system might be the only real justice left. The officers continued dragging him down the corridor, and Raymond watched as his shadow disappeared around the corner. Something in his chest was burning, not rage, not even grief, but betrayal. And beneath that, a quiet storm was building. Because Holloway was right about one thing. He wasn't the only one. Back at the department, the files were starting to come in. Complaints long ignored. Statements rewritten. Cases conveniently closed. And in the middle of it all, Raymond found names, supervisors who had vouched for Holloway, officers who had turned their backs on evidence, even lieutenants who had played dumb every time a concern was raised. It wasn't just one man. It never had been. That evening, in a press conference outside City Hall, Raymond stood before a sea of reporters. The microphones picked up every word. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture that allowed him to thrive. And starting tonight, that culture ends. There will be consequences. And they won't be quiet. He paused, scanning the crowd. But I need everyone to understand something. Justice for my daughter isn't just his arrest. It's not a court date. It's a reckoning. And it's coming. Inside the building, the mayor and police commission were already arguing behind closed doors about next steps. The legal implications were staggering. But the public had seen too much. There was no spinning this. No strategy. The people wanted heads to roll. And they were going to get them. Later that night, back at home, Raymond sat across from Amara at the kitchen table. She looked at him, tired, still hollowed out, but stronger now, in a quiet, broken way. "Are they going to charge him?" she asked. "Yes." "Will he go to prison?" "That depends on what else we find." There was a long pause. "He looked at me like I was nothing," she said. Raymond's voice cracked. "He won't be the last man to do that. But he'll be the last to get away with it." She nodded slowly. "I want to speak. Publicly. I want them to hear it from me." Raymond stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "Then we'll make sure they listen." But none of them could have known what would happen in the next 24 hours. Because as Raymond dug deeper, he uncovered something far more dangerous than one rogue officer. A cover-up. Deliberate. Calculated. And the man who signed off on it was someone Raymond had once called a friend. And when the name crossed his desk, he knew this wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was going to be war. The office was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock, but the silence inside Raymond's chest was louder than anything he had heard all day. The name on the document in front of him felt like a slap he hadn't seen coming. It was written in clean black ink, perfectly aligned at the bottom of a routine incident report, a report that had suppressed complaints against Holloway, dismissed multiple allegations of misconduct, and redirected internal investigations without follow-up. Signed, approved, and closed. The name was Captain Elliot Granger. A man Raymond had worked alongside for more than 2 decades. A man who had stood beside him during his promotion ceremony. A man who had shared dinners with Raymond and Amara on holidays, who had once cried with Raymond the day his wife died, sitting on his back porch until night fell. That name didn't just sting. It ripped. Raymond leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the ceiling as if it could offer answers. The betrayal curled inside his gut like rusted wire. It wasn't just the file. It was the pattern. The redacted names. The misfiled complaints. The calls that were never logged. And Granger's signature appeared on all of it, not once or twice, but consistently, over the span of 6 years. He had been cleaning up Holloway's messes. Shielding him. And now Raymond had to face the fact that the man he trusted most had been the quiet architect behind the system that nearly cost Amara her life. He didn't call Granger immediately. Instead, he walked to the precinct's evidence room and requested the original case files. The room clerk, a young officer named Valenzuela, looked uneasy. "Sir, those files have been restricted for high-clearance access only." "I am the highest clearance in this building," Raymond said without blinking. "Open the cabinet." The files were there, dozens of them, all tied to Holloway or other officers under Granger's former command. Patterns emerged fast. Repeat names. Victims with no follow-up. Officers reassigned instead of reprimanded. Raymond scanned through them, his chest tightening with every page. These weren't just oversights. They were intentional. And the deeper he read, the more obvious it became, this hadn't been about protecting Holloway's reputation. It had been about protecting something larger. A reputation, a culture, a department that needed to look clean at all costs. He picked up the phone and dialed Granger's number. It rang once, twice, and then he picked up with the same familiar voice Raymond had known for years. "Ray," he said, sounding tired but casual, as if nothing had changed. "I was about to call you. Hell of a day, huh? I need to see you. Tonight." There was a pause. "Everything all right?" "No," Granger hesitated. "Okay. Where?" "My house." Another pause. "I'll be there in 30. Raymond hung up. When Granger arrived, he stepped into the living room with that same disarming ease he always carried, like nothing could touch him. He smiled weakly when he saw Raymond, glanced at Amara, who was sitting on the stairs listening, and offered a nod. "Hey, kiddo." Amara didn't answer. She stared at him, her face unreadable, her arms crossed over her knees. Granger cleared his throat. "Ray, I know tensions are high right now, but maybe we should," Raymond cut him off. "Sit." The command was quiet, but it left no room for argument. Granger sank into the armchair across from him. Raymond placed the files on the coffee table between them, his fingers resting on the top page. "I've gone through everything. Every complaint. Every signature. Every cover-up. You didn't just let it happen. You made sure no one could stop it." Granger leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Ray, it wasn't like that. You buried a report where a 12-year-old boy said Holloway slammed his head into a locker and called him a thug. I didn't know all the details at the time. Your name was on the interview summary. I was under pressure. The department, you were the department." Granger sat forward now, his voice harder. "You think this is easy? You think every situation comes with a clean answer? I made calls that protected this force from collapse. From lawsuits. From turning into a circus. You protected a predator. I protected the shield. I protected the community from losing faith in us. You lied to the community. I did what had to be done." Raymond's jaw clenched, the rage trembling behind his eyes. "You almost got my daughter killed." That sentence cracked the room wide open. Granger looked down, his shoulders heavy. "I never meant for that to happen. I didn't know it would go that far. Holloway, he always walked the line, but you thought if you kept the lid on tight enough, it would never boil over. I thought I could manage him. I thought you could handle him if it got out of hand. Raymond stood slowly, his voice shaking now, not with anger, but with something deeper. You used my loyalty. You used our friendship to keep me blind. You let me stand in front of this city and promise them protection while you made sure the people who needed it most were left to fend for themselves. I didn't want to lose what we built. What we built? Raymond's voice cracked. You built something rotten. I trusted you with my family, Elliot. And you built a system that could have buried my daughter. Granger rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking older than ever. So what now? You're gonna take me down with Holloway? Raymond didn't answer right away. He looked at Amara, who had moved down a few steps, watching, breathing slow, her eyes red but steady. You're going to resign, Raymond said. Effective immediately. You're going to sign a sworn statement detailing every report you've altered, every officer you've shielded, and every superior who pressured you to keep it buried. Granger's eyes widened. Ray, if you refuse, I go public. With everything. Not just your signature. Your meetings. Your emails. Your voice recordings. Granger swallowed. You've been recording me. I started recording the day you lied to my face. Granger stared at him for a long time, then looked away. You're gonna destroy this department. I'm gonna rebuild it. Granger slumped in a chair, defeated, the weight of years collapsing onto his back. You do this, Raymond continued, his voice steadier now, you get to walk out with dignity. You refuse, and you'll be remembered as the man who let children get hurt to protect his pension. The silence stretched. Then, finally, Granger nodded once. All right. Raymond didn't thank him. He didn't forgive him. He stood still as a monument as Granger got up and left the house. The door closed behind him. Raymond exhaled and turned to his daughter. She didn't speak. She just walked into his arms and buried her face in his chest. The next morning, news broke. Captain Elliot Granger had resigned. A full internal investigation was underway. Charges against Brent Holloway had been escalated to include attempted murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of child endangerment. And at the center of the storm stood Chief Raymond Williams and his daughter, not as victims, but as survivors who refused to let silence win. But even as justice began to take shape, Raymond knew the road ahead would not be easy. Because some shadows didn't fall all at once. They had to be peeled back. One layer at a time. And the reckoning was just beginning. The days that followed unraveled like a tightly wound cord finally snapping. The city was no longer whispering. It was shouting. Walls that had held secrets for years were cracking wide open. Raymond found himself in meeting after meeting, camera flash after camera flash, giving statements that were half policy, half promise, and every inch personal. He spoke at press conferences with the weight of two identities on his shoulders, chief and father, and each word came from a place deeper than just obligation. But as the headlines multiplied and the pressure mounted, it became clear that justice, even when in motion, did not move cleanly. The resignation of Captain Granger had shocked the city, but for many, it wasn't enough. Protesters now held signs not only with Holloway's name, but with names of every officer involved in previous cover-ups, every captain who had signed off on dismissed reports, and every official who had turned a blind eye. People weren't just demanding accountability. They were demanding transformation. Inside the department, tensions boiled under the surface. Officers whispered in corners, some refusing to meet Raymond's eye in the hallways, others nodding quietly in support when no one was watching. He knew the culture wouldn't change overnight. For some, he had become a hero. For others, a traitor. And yet, none of it mattered to him as much as the person waiting for him each night when he got home. Amara had gone back to school, but her silence lingered. She walked a little slower, looked a little deeper. Her teachers were gentle with her. Her friends, though supportive, didn't always know what to say. And while she tried to return to normal routines, nothing really felt normal. Every hallway felt louder. Every classroom, smaller. Every passing glance carried weight. She had become the face of a national conversation, and at 17, the burden of that visibility was almost unbearable. At home, their conversations became more layered, edged with reflection. One night, as they sat in the kitchen while the kettle steamed softly in the background, Amara asked him something that twisted something inside him. "Do you think people would have cared if you weren't chief?" Raymond looked up slowly, his spoon pausing mid-stir in his tea. He didn't answer right away. He placed the spoon down gently, folded his hands, and stared at them for a long moment before finally speaking. "I've asked myself the same question," he said quietly. "And I don't know. That's the part that hurts the most." Her eyes didn't leave his. "It shouldn't have taken your badge for them to listen." "No," he said. "It shouldn't have." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, the weight of the truth pressing down on both of them. "There are other girls like me. Other stories. I keep thinking about that. What happens to the ones no one records?" Raymond nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening. That's why this can't stop with him. But that was the part that had grown the most complicated. Because the deeper the investigation went, the more names surfaced. And not all of them were strangers. Some were men and women Raymond had mentored. People who'd attended Amara's birthdays, brought casseroles to his house when his wife passed, celebrated promotions and retirements in the very conference rooms now being used for interrogations. And with each file that crossed his desk, the dilemma grew heavier. Loyalty versus integrity. Brotherhood versus truth. He had once believed those things could exist side by side. But now he saw the lines so clearly they cut. One of those names was Lieutenant Morrison. A man who had been with the department almost as long as Raymond. Smart, respected, admired by both the force and the community. But now, flagged in a document showing direct involvement in suppressing at least 2 misconduct complaints against Holloway, cases involving young black boys stopped near the same neighborhood Amara had passed through. The evidence was there. Morrison had redirected the internal reviews, pressured the officers involved to change their statements, and even falsified a timeline in one of the reports. Raymond called him into his office. Morrison arrived with confusion written across his face. "Is this about the protest coordination?" Raymond slid the file across the desk. "Read it." Morrison's smile dropped. His eyes scanned the page. His jaw tightened. But he didn't deny it. Raymond waited. No interruptions. No assumptions. After a long silence, Morrison looked up. "Ray, we were trying to protect the department. You know how volatile things were after Ferguson, after every damn viral clip. I didn't want the department dragged through the mud." Raymond's voice was calm, measured, but each word struck like a stone. "So you buried a kid's story to protect an institution." You erased his voice. "I was trying to protect the bigger picture. The bigger picture is people, Dan. The community. Their trust. Their safety. Not the illusion of a spotless badge." Morrison sat back, frustration bubbling. "You're only saying that now because it was your daughter." Raymond's fists clenched under the desk. "No. I'm saying it louder now. Because I know what silence costs." There was no shouting. No slamming of doors. Just a resignation letter quietly signed the next morning, and another press statement prepared for release. But for Raymond, these victories came with grief. Every name on every file was a person he once believed in. Every removal left a hole in a structure already unsteady. He was rebuilding with trembling hands, knowing that every decision stripped away comfort but brought him closer to truth. Amara watched it all unfold from the edge of his world. She began journaling late at night, pouring her thoughts into pages, letting them catch the things she didn't know how to say aloud. She started attending community forums, not speaking much at first, but listening intently. And slowly, she found herself standing up. She gave her first public statement 3 weeks after the incident. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She told the truth, plainly, and with more strength than most adults twice her age could muster. She said what happened to her wasn't new. That what happened was part of a larger sickness. That change wasn't about one man being punished. It was about ensuring no one ever had to be that afraid again. The room had gone silent. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. Raymond had watched from the side, his heart breaking and mending at the same time. But still, something darker was brewing. A document landed on his desk from the city's legal office. A notice of pending litigation. A group of officers removed from duty following the internal investigations, had filed a complaint. Alleging unfair treatment. Claiming defamation. Accusing Raymond of using the tragedy for personal revenge. He sat with the paper in his hands, the weight of irony so heavy it almost felt laughable. Later that night, Amara asked him if he ever wished they could go back to how things were before. He thought for a long time. "I wish we'd never had to find out how broken it was," he said. "But no. I don't want to go back. Going back means letting it happen again." And yet, even as they pushed forward, the question remained. Would truth be enough? Would the people who now stood by them still be there when the cameras turned off? Would the system they were trying to fix ever stop resisting the very change it so desperately needed? And deep inside, Raymond knew they hadn't reached the end. Because the final decision, the one that would truly define this moment in history, had yet to be made. And it was going to demand everything he had left to give. The house was quiet again, but not in the comforting way it used to be. It was the kind of quiet that wrapped around Raymond's chest and refused to let go, the kind that came after too many battles, too many statements, too many faces offering sympathy while questioning his every move behind closed doors. The living room was dark except for the soft glow of a floor lamp, casting long shadows on the hardwood. Raymond sat alone, elbows on his knees, staring at the open file on the coffee table, the lawsuit documents, the accusations, the official response from the city's legal team. The words blurred as he tried to read them again, not because he was tired, but because they were absurd in their familiarity. Once again, people who had done wrong were weaponizing the system to avoid consequences. Once again, the spotlight was shifting from the real injustice to the discomfort of those who were finally being held accountable. He heard footsteps on the stairs and didn't turn. He knew it was Amara. She moved with that same quiet grace her mother used to have when she was lost in thought. She came down and sat beside him without a word, pulling her legs up on the couch and wrapping her arms around them. She looked at the document in front of them and let out a soft, dry laugh. "So now we're the villains." Raymond closed the file. "Seems like it." She shook her head, staring at the wall. "I don't get it. They lied. They hurt people. They covered it up. And we, what? We told the truth. We broke the silence," he said slowly. "And when you break silence, people don't just get angry, they get scared." There was a long pause before Amara spoke again. Her voice was quieter this time, almost trembling. "Do you ever wish you hadn't pushed this far?" Raymond looked at her, his face softening. "Every day," he said, "I wish this never had to happen. But no. I don't wish we stopped. Because if we had stopped, you'd still be lying awake at night wondering if anyone cared. And I'd still be sitting in that office pretending I didn't know what I know now." She didn't answer. She just nodded slowly, letting his words settle into the ache inside her chest. The next morning, Raymond stood before the city council in a hearing that had been expedited due to public pressure. The room was tense, crowded with media, with members of the public, and with a strange mixture of supporters and critics, all watching him closely. He knew this wasn't just about his job anymore. It wasn't even about Holloway or Granger. It was about the institution. The council members took turns questioning him, some out of genuine need for clarity, others clearly angling to cast doubt on his leadership. One of them, a man who had been silent for most of the hearing, finally leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "You understand, Chief Williams, that what you've done has created serious instability within the department. Morale is down. Public trust is divided. You've exposed the city to significant liability." Raymond leaned in too. Calm. Unwavering. "What I've done is enforce the law equally. What I've done is remind this department that justice isn't selective. If that creates instability, then maybe we need it to be shaken." Another councilwoman, more sympathetic, spoke next. "But where does this lead, Chief? You've removed nearly a dozen officers. Some were veterans. Some were decorated. Do you think the department can survive this?" Raymond's voice held no hesitation. "We can't afford not to. We've survived too long pretending we were clean. Now it's time to be honest. That's the only way we move forward." Amara watched from the back of the room, sitting with her hands in her lap, every muscle in her body tensed. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was enough. Every person in that chamber knew who she was. Knew what had happened. Knew the pain they had tried to sweep under a bureaucratic rug. Her silence said more than most speeches could. After the hearing, as they walked down the hall together, she asked him quietly, "Do they believe you?" Raymond gave a faint smile. "Some do. Some never will." "Then why keep going?" "Because I still believe in what this job can be. And I still believe in you." That night, the mayor called him. Not with condemnation. But with a proposition. The department needed to rebuild, not just policies, but trust, community relationships, recruitment standards. And the mayor wanted Raymond to lead it. Not just as chief, but as the head of a new initiative that would audit internal affairs, build youth engagement programs, and restructure training from the ground up. "It's a political move," Raymond said into the phone, pacing slowly through the hallway. "Maybe," the mayor replied. "But it's also a chance to reshape everything. And we can't do it without you." Raymond was silent for a long moment. "I need to talk to my daughter first." When he told Amara, she didn't react at first. Then she looked at him, her eyes heavy but steady. "You said once you wanted to protect people. That's still what you want, right?" He nodded. "Then do it." He reached for her hand. She squeezed it. The following weeks were a storm of restructuring. Officers were retrained. Civilian oversight boards were given new powers. Community leaders were brought into the fold. And while not everyone embraced the change, the tide had turned. Slowly. Painfully. But it was turning. Amara began speaking at schools, youth panels, and town halls. Not because she wanted attention, but because she realized her voice could prevent the next silence. People listened. Young girls who looked like her came up and hugged her after events, sometimes crying, sometimes just holding her hand in gratitude. Raymond kept showing up. To meetings. To rallies. To courtrooms. He testified in cases tied to past misconduct. He sat with families who had once feared him in uniform. And every time he walked back into his home, it was Amara waiting for him, asking him how it went, reminding him why it mattered. But as they rebuilt, Raymond never forgot that justice had come at a cost. That the system didn't bend easily. That for every policy changed, there was still someone resisting in the shadows. He remained alert, aware that silence might return if he let his guard down. Still, he chose to move forward. Not because he believed everything was fixed. But because he had decided to no longer be a part of what was broken. And as Amara stood at her high school graduation, delivering a speech not about trauma but about resilience, he sat in the front row, tears in his eyes, finally understanding that justice isn't a destination. It's a choice. And they had made it. Together. The summer brought heat that clung to the skin, days that felt longer than they should have, and a city still finding its footing after the kind of storm that didn't come with wind, but with truth. The police department was quieter now, not in the way that suggested order but in the way that meant everyone was watching their own steps, weighing their words, feeling the pressure of a new era take hold. Raymond's office had changed too. Not just in decor or procedure, but in presence. Files were now cross-checked by civilians, monthly reviews included voices from the community, and most of all, officers weren't just expected to enforce the law, they were expected to understand the people they served. It was slow, exhausting work. And even with all the changes, the resistance had never really disappeared. It just shifted underground, into cold stares and passive aggression, into whispered doubts behind closed doors. But Raymond knew this was part of it. You didn't fix a cracked foundation without pulling up every rotting beam first. And some of those beams had names he'd once said grace beside. One of them was Sergeant Leary. For years, Leary had flown under the radar, good record, few complaints, the kind of cop who smiled wide in photos and rarely got his hands dirty himself. But a recent whistleblower complaint had painted a different picture. Not about physical abuse or direct harassment, but about enabling. About watching Holloway and others like him cross the line, about laughing along during locker room retellings, about erasing footage he'd been asked to archive. Raymond had brought him in for a closed-door conversation that turned into something else entirely. Leary sat stiffly across the desk, jaw clenched, eyes not meeting Raymond's. When confronted with the allegations, he didn't deny them. He didn't even flinch. He shrugged, leaned back, and said with that same smirk Raymond remembered from years ago, "We all had to play the game, Chief. You included." Raymond's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "What I did was survive in a broken system. What I'm doing now is fixing it." Leary chuckled bitterly. "You think this town's changed because you made a few headlines? This place bends for a while, then it snaps right back." Raymond stood, placed his hands on the desk, leaned in. "Then I guess we're going to keep bending it until it breaks for good." Leary was dismissed a week later. Amara had taken on more than anyone expected. She had become a name beyond Oak Ridge, her story echoing through interviews, forums, and even national panels. But it wasn't the attention that moved her, it was the impact. At first, she thought speaking up might be a one-time thing, something she'd do to bring light to what had happened. But the more she spoke, the more she realized how many others needed her voice. Girls from different cities. Boys with fear etched into their daily routines. Parents who held their breath every time their child left the house. She wasn't trying to be a leader. She just didn't want anyone to feel as alone as she had that day on the tracks. One night, after returning from a panel in Atlanta, she sat at the kitchen table with Raymond, both of them tired but wide awake. They hadn't had a real conversation in days, both swept into their respective battles. She looked at him across the table, her voice soft but firm. "Do you think we're actually making a difference?" Raymond put down the pen he was holding, looked at her with that quiet gravity she had come to recognize. "Yes," he said. "But not fast enough." She nodded. "It's like trying to clean a wound that keeps getting infected. Change always bleeds before it heals." She watched him, studied the lines in his face that seemed deeper now. "You look tired." "I am." "Then why keep going?" He gave a small smile. "Because I've seen what happens when we don't." Amara leaned forward, her voice catching a little. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel safe again. Not just walking, but existing." Raymond reached across the table, placed his hand over hers. "You will. Not because they'll give it to you. But because you'll take it back. Every time you speak. Every time you stand. You're claiming space they tried to take from you." She squeezed his hand. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. The lawsuit filed by the dismissed officers gained traction. A few public figures even echoed their claims, arguing that Raymond's actions were politically motivated, that he'd made scapegoats of his own team, that he'd fractured the department in a selfish attempt to protect his reputation. The pressure was real. But what hurt most was the betrayal of people he had once fought beside. Men and women who knew exactly what the culture had been, and still chose comfort over honesty. The city scheduled a final public hearing, one that would determine whether Raymond's reforms would be locked into policy or reversed under departmental restructuring. It was, essentially, a vote on everything he had built. That night before the hearing, he and Amara sat on the back porch, watching the sky slowly dim into evening. The cicadas buzzed in the background, and for a moment, the world felt still. "If they vote against you," she asked, "what happens?" "I step down." She turned to him sharply. "You'd walk away." "I'd refuse to work under a system that insists on staying broken." She shook her head. "But they need you. They need more than me. They need truth, integrity. They need the fight to keep going even if I'm not there." There was a pause before she whispered, "And what about me?" Raymond looked at her, eyes full of pride and pain all at once. "You already took the fight further than I ever could." The next day, the hearing chamber was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Some brought signs, others held quiet hope in their expressions. Raymond stood at the front, not as a man defending his job, but as someone testifying on behalf of everyone who never had the chance. Amara sat behind him, her presence a quiet shield. He spoke of accountability. Of the rot he had discovered within the institution. Of the pain his own daughter endured. Of the officers who had stood by and those who had stood up. Of the future he believed was still possible. He didn't use notes. He didn't posture. He spoke like a man who had already given everything and still had more left to give. When the vote was called, the chamber went still. 6-4. 2 against. The reforms passed. Raymond remained chief. But more than that, the policies were cemented into the department's future. When he walked out into the hallway, Amara was already standing there, tears in her eyes. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her into his arms, held her for a long time, and whispered, "We're still here." And that was the moment everything shifted again. Not because the battle was over. But because they had proven it was possible to survive it. Together. The city that had once trembled under the weight of silence now stood on steadier ground. It hadn't healed completely, no place so fractured could ever do so overnight, but something had shifted in its bones. People no longer whispered their stories behind closed doors. They shared them. Loudly. Boldly. In classrooms, in churches, in meetings where they were once told to be quiet. The police department wasn't perfect, but it was no longer the same. Internal affairs now operated with full transparency, officers underwent routine community engagement reviews, and diversity wasn't just a hiring goal, it was part of the institution's DNA. Raymond Williams remained at the helm, not because of power, but because of purpose. And for the first time in his entire career, he wasn't wearing his badge out of duty alone. He wore it for justice. For legacy. For the ones who never got to speak. Sergeant Leary, after being dismissed, attempted to sue for wrongful termination, but the case collapsed under the weight of evidence. He left town quietly, the smirk long gone from his face, unable to reclaim the silence that once protected him. As for Captain Granger, he fulfilled his part of the deal, resigned, submitted sworn statements, and disappeared from public view. But in the rare moments when his name was mentioned, it was always with a strange mix of disdain and sadness. He wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He was something worse. A man who knew better and chose comfort over courage. His silence had cost lives, trust, and in the end, his own peace. Brent Holloway faced trial and was found guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder and abuse of authority under color of law. The courtroom was packed the day of his sentencing, with families who had once been too afraid to speak now standing tall, holding photos and memories, naming each child who had once been cast aside. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, stripped of his pension, and labeled as what he truly was, not a protector, but a predator. For the first time, those who had feared his presence walked freely again, knowing the badge he had misused could never hurt them again. But the story didn't end in courtrooms or news headlines. It continued in the quiet courage of a 17-year-old girl who turned her pain into power. Amara Williams not only graduated with honors but earned a full scholarship to a top university with a focus on public policy and ethics. She didn't run from what happened, she built from it. She launched a foundation dedicated to advocacy and legal support for youth facing racial injustice. What began as a single panel turned into a national speaking tour. Her words echoed across cities, inspiring others to rise, to speak, to resist. She was no longer the girl who had once laid helpless on the tracks. She had become a voice the world could not ignore. 1 year after the hearing, Raymond sat in the audience of a university auditorium, watching Amara speak to a packed crowd. She didn't read from notes. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the weight of lived experience and the light of unwavering resolve. When she finished, the room erupted, not out of pity or applause, but respect. He watched her step down from the stage, her shoulders square, her head held high, and he knew, deep in his chest, that this was what legacy truly looked like. Not medals. Not plaques. But a child who refuses to repeat history, even when the world begs her to forget it. Afterward, she found him near the back of the room, the way she always did. He smiled as she approached, and she hugged him tighter than she had in a long time. Neither said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. Then she pulled back slightly and said, "I think Mom would have been proud." Raymond nodded, his eyes damp. "She would have seen everything in you that I see every day." They walked out of the auditorium together, past students who had waited in line just to thank her, to shake her hand, to say that her story gave them strength. Outside, the sky was streaked with orange and violet, the kind of sunset that felt symbolic, as if the world was closing one chapter only to open another. And as they stood there in that quiet, just the two of them, Raymond realized something profound. They had not just survived. They had rewritten the ending. For every person who thought justice was out of reach. For every voice that had been silenced by fear. For every name that had been buried by shame. They had proven that truth, when spoken with courage, could shake the walls of any institution. And rebuild them with something stronger. Now, let me ask you something. What would you do if the system meant to protect you turned its back on you? Would you stay silent? Would you walk away? Or would you rise, even while trembling, and speak? Amara didn't ask to become a symbol. But she became one anyway, because she chose truth over comfort. Because she chose to speak when her voice still trembled. Because she refused to let silence be her legacy. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there listening to this story is sitting on their own truth, wondering if they're strong enough to say it out loud. You are. This story isn't just about injustice. It's about resilience. About accountability. About transformation. And above all, about what happens when one voice becomes 1,000. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something real, don't let it end here. Comment below what part struck you the most, what you took from Amara's journey, and what kind of world you want to help build. And if you want more stories like this, stories that twist, that challenge, that inspire, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and be part of this movement for change. We're just getting started.